help me think that during the time that I was running all over the nation to train with everybody I could find, uh, that watching this video today would have been very much a gift and helpful. See the faces that were here, faces that we were hearing about, faces that some trained with, but that I'm thinking a lot about that right this minute, about how good of that would have been to have experienced that in the middle of my training, my personal training.
Yeah. Everybody to the USA Transactional Analysis Association Zoom 6 conversation. I'm Val Chang and I'm the moderator today, and I think we're going to have a very fun, lively conversation because we have 4 very interesting participants. I'll introduce them as they first speak. But each one of them is a TA therapist, a trainer, a leader, has been involved in all the TA organizations, great people. And we're all friends too, which is nice. So we're going to talk about 3 topics. The first is, what first attracted you to transactional analysis? Then we're going to talk about their involvement in international and local TA organizations. And finally, something about the training each person had in transactional analysis. Fanita is one of the pioneers in transactional analysis. She started way back with Eric Byrne, who, as you probably know, is a psychiatrist who started TA and wrote the famous Games People play. And Fanita worked with him. And did her training with him. And then she went on to teach and train, I don't have any idea how many people, in the United States and Western Europe. She has done a lot of writing and exploring and presenting. So, Fanita, we're very glad to have you. And we're going to talk a little bit about what first interested you about transactional analysis.
All right. What is it? Byrne's first little book, which is called, it's a tiny little book, and it's called TA in Therapy. And what happened was that at the time I was doing psychoanalytic therapy under the banner of social workers, clinical social workers in Chicago. And I had gotten very disenchanted with my way of working, very bored. It was based on the psychoanalytic model, and complaining about it to my colleagues. And one day, one of them hands me this little book and says, I picked up this book in the airport in San Francisco. I got the book, I started reading it, and of course I couldn't drop it. And I went to the telephone and called Eric, looked it up in the international, and called the USAT or whatever it was called at the time, and happened to reach Eric at the telephone, very surprised and happy. Do you ever come to Chicago, said I. Yes, as a matter of fact, I'm coming through next week on my way to New York. And he volunteered that even before I asked anything further. I'll be glad to meet with you and a few other people for an afternoon and gave us his terms right away. You pay my hotel room, my evening dinner, and well, principally that. Might do something about transportation, small transportation. Wonderful. So we agreed on that right there. I won't continue. The rest is history.
Our next participant is Felipe Garcia. And Felipe lives in Texas and has done a lot of training of many, many people in Texas. But then he also travels absolutely all over the world. I think he's probably been a presenter at every single international TA conference, or almost every single one.
Yeah.
So many, many people have met and worked with Felipe. He's a founding member of USADA, the USA TA Association. So Felipe, what attracted you to TA initially?
Well, I was at the time doing school counseling, and I could tell that the problems that were being brought to me by the students were not, I did not have the training that I needed to work with them, because it was a junior high school and it was usually have to do with family problems rather than just the problem of the student. And so I was doing that when I read I'm Okay, You're Okay. That's the first book that I read, even before Burns' Hello book, which I read afterwards. And so like Fanita was saying, I just couldn't stop reading it. It was just, this is exactly what I need. And just the concept of parent, adult, child got me so interested in TA. And so I contacted Tom Harris, and I went and spent a week in Sacramento with him and his wife, Amy, who I think was very instrumental in writing the book. And that's how I did my TA 101. And I think it was 1972. I'm not very good at dates, but I think it was around 1972. And I finished that week of training. It was a week for the 101. And then I got my 101 and became a regular member. And then it was hard finding a training group, because John Gladfelter was doing training in San Antonio, but the group was full. TA was very popular at the time already. And so eventually I got into the John Gladfelter's group, and then the rest is history. But the question about what made you interested in TA is besides of how I got interested in TA and why. But what is the whole idea of okayness, the whole idea of autonomy, the whole idea that you can manage your life, your feelings, and the whole idea of it's a model of collaborative work and contractual work rather than the medical model which we were used to. And so all of those things were very interesting to me.
Our next participant is Lucy Freedman. She has been a leader, an organizer in both USADA and ITAA for many years. She's a therapist, a teacher, a consultant, and just done so much for all of the levels of organizations. So, Lucy, I turn it over to you. What excited you initially about TA?
Well, what initially drew me in was my older sister had been to some TA marathons, which were weekend sessions that people did. And I remember when she first suggested that I go to one, and I was like, I don't need that. And we had a conversation about our childhood, and I was in tears, and I went, okay, I'll go with you. And so my introduction was to go to this entire weekend of therapy in the reparenting school of TA, which was just what excited me about it was, oh, you can talk about these things. There are ways to talk about these things that were always there in the swirl of life. And I was a high school teacher at the time, and very idealistic. And the whole concept, like Felipe, of okayness, and also working by contract. So after that first weekend of therapy, I walked into a 10th grade classroom on Monday morning, and everybody made a contract. Those kids were going to be treated as being okay, and they could make their choices. So that was my entry into TA.
Vince Gilpin. And he has been very active in the Canadian TA Association, the International Transactional Association, and I thought he was the main person for all of Canada. He tells me that there were a few others, but he did a lot of training in Canada and many presentations around the world also. So Vince, what was it that attracted you?
I come from Jamaica to Kingston, Ontario as a social worker. And I was working in the adult outpatients clinic. The psychiatrist in charge asked me if I would do marriage counseling. Done any marriage counseling, but I said, well, I have an idea. I'll do some of that. So I was assigned to do marriage counseling. But then the assistant head of the department of psychiatry asked me to join him in conducting groups with medical students. And we used to have a good time with the students on Friday afternoons. And he said, you know, I went to a conference of psychiatrists and met Robert Goulding. And he tells me he has a training program in group psychotherapy. So why don't you go down and check him out? So I thought, well, why not? So they sent me down for a month.
Oh, neat.
I went to I think it was the second 1 month training program at Western Institute. And, you know, had a great time. There are some great guys in the group. But it was the first time in all of my training as a social worker and stuff that the trainees were asked to deal with their own conflicts and situations and whatever. And what I loved about it, it did not pathologize people's problems, but instead saw people as making decisions under certain circumstances and developing habits which persist into adulthood. So when I got back to Canada, all the members of the staff, the nurse, the social workers were keen on what this TA thing was all about. And that's when I read Games People Play. After I had been exposed to Bob and Mary Goulding. And I did groups in the clinic for couples as well as individuals. And my boss, the head of social work, she always wanted to join the groups. And so she came in as a co-therapist and we worked together. We had a great time. So I love TA. I love the fact that it wasn't about pathology, but rather about human decision-making and stuff like that.
What we're going to go on to is for each of you to have an opportunity to talk about your involvement with the International Transactional Analysis Association. And then Fanita and Lucy and Felipe were organizers in the US Transactional Association. So they'll have a conversation about that. And Vince will talk a little bit about how Canada got organized. Let's start with ITAA. Anybody want to start and say a bit about your involvement with the International TA Association?
I will jump in because I preceded Vince in one of the big roles in the ITAA, so I should go ahead of him. The part that I will speak about now is that ITAA was founded as a U.S. organization, and it called itself the International TA Association. And it was Muriel James, who was president of ITAA at the time, who saw me at a conference, and I was new and I was just passing my exam, and she invited me to get involved with the organization ITAA. And I started getting on committees and and things like that. So I have Muriel to blame for that part. But as she was president, she was being revolutionary because she traveled around the world and found and met with other TA people who had then spread internationally. And she was convening groups of people who were presidents of their own TA associations. And she was getting that dialogue going. And then when Ellen Bader was president of ITAA, she took that even further. And at that time, I was seeing the disconnect between ITAA saying it was an international organization, but being almost totally in the US, with a few outliers. And as Muriel was doing her ambassadorship and then Ellen, I joined with a French guy named Vincent Lenhart, and we formed the World Integration Committee in 1983 and started proposing that ITAA truly internationalize. And some of the fallout from that actually did involve your wife, Vince, because Suzanne led some of the process of affiliations between ITAA and other associations around the world.
Became active in ITAA. And the thing about Leonard Gann, by the way, he said that Byrne, when he started the San Francisco TA Association, or whatever the first name was. But then there were two Canadians who were members. And Byrne said, but this is international. So we will call it the International Transactional Analysis Association. And it was based on, and Leonard Gann emphasizes that a lot. Poor Leonard is dead now. But he emphasized that a lot, that being a member then inspired Byrne to call it ITAA instead of the San Francisco Association. In the ITAA, I was most active in the BOC, Board of Certification, and Val, you remember our time on that together. I was chair of that for a while. And then after that, and this was after Lucy, that I became president. One of the things I wanted to do at the time was to get TA people around the world to pay attention to the issue of climate change and saving the earth. So I organized a one-day called World TA Day and asked people around the world to do something that day that was both transactional analysis and environmental awareness. And we got people in Japan, Australia, Canada, of course, the US, and we had quite a number of people. It wasn't as big and as successful as I'd hoped it would be, but it happened. And I'm very proud of that.
Felipe, would you talk a little bit about your involvement in the ITAA, and then we'll go on to USADA?
Well, it's hard for me to remember exactly when I went. The first conference I think that I went to was in 1975 in San Francisco. And Jacques Doucet was the president. And there was a lot of people at the conference, and a big gathering room was full. And Jacques Doucet was like a rock star up there on the stage. He was just, and I was so turned on by him because he was so charismatic and so loving. And I just got so turned on by the people. Ever since that time, that first conference, and every conference ever since, and every gathering, including the present one, it's always a joy. It was always such a joy to be with these people. So it's about the people rather than the organization. But slowly, I got interested in the organization, and also, like Lucy and Vince, and got involved in this committee or that committee. Social actions, I remember early on. And then Muriel James asked me to be on the membership committee. I was on the board of trustees. I was on the editorial board of the TAJ for a year or two. And so I got involved.
Val, will you talk a little bit more about your
I
involvement?
did a lot of things in the ITAA, so many that I'd go to conferences at nifty cities like Montreal, and all I saw was the inside of the darned hotel when I went from committee to committee. I did a lot of things with the training and standards. I think that was a major push for me. I was on, I don't know how many exam committees, and Emily Rupert and I did quite a bit of rewriting of some of those training standards. And I was on the board of directors, and I think social action, and a lot of things, kept busy.
But it became clear that there was no U.S. association. No, and that ITAA tended to identify itself as the USA association, and people didn't want to give that up. And so that's where Felipe comes in, and we started talking about the USA needing its own association.
So now, Felipe and Fanita and Lucy, tell us about the very beginning of USADA.
USATA was founded by Felipe, Lucy, and myself while we were in Texas deciding
I
that.
remember landing on a flight for a conference in Monterey, California, for a winter conference. And it just dawned on me that it was time, that because of all that was happening, it was time to have a USATA organization, or a US organization. And I don't remember what we were calling it. So I talked to Lucy and Val Batts, were the first two that, because they were friends, and they thought, and Lucy, as mentioned, was already interested in the relationship between the international transactional analysis and the local national organizations. And it was becoming more and more obvious that the ITA needed to attend to international work. And it was getting more and more removed from the US. And it was soon after that that the ITA started having conferences in San Francisco every 3 years, but in the in-between, the conference would be at another country. And so during the year that the conference was at another country, there was no conference in the US. So it just became quite obvious that we needed a US organization. And so Lucy, at least Lucy, Val, and I don't remember if Fanita was involved at the time, but soon after that, Fanita joined us. And I remember going to Mexico, to Acapulco, Mexico, and Muriel James was at a conference there. And it was a Mexican conference. And I talked, Muriel at the time must have been president. Anybody remember when Muriel was president? Because it must have been then. It was around 1981, somewhere in there. And I brought up the subject to her and James at lunch of starting a USATA. And she said, well, tell me more, I'm kind of interested. And then before long, she and Mary and Fanita became very interested. And so the first organizing meeting that I can find in the records was that informal one in Monterey. And then after that one, Fanita, well, I invited people to come here to my place where I had a training center to come have a meeting to organize the organization. And the only one, it was on Memorial Day weekend of 1982.
Wow.
Memorial Day weekend, yeah. And Fanita, Lucy, and I were the only ones that came to the meeting. So we had a lot of fun, but we got a lot of work done. I have the notes from that meeting, and that got us ready for the organizing meeting, which happened in 1982 in Snowmass, Colorado. Mm. And that was a big gathering between 4 and 6 p.m. after the exams, and there were like 60 people interested, and there was a lot of controversy, there was a lot of controversy, and a lot of people were very involved in the ITA. And I remember long lines getting to talk. I remember Vince at the microphone talking. Remember when we stand in line to talk at the meetings? So that meeting in Snowmass had about 60 people. I have a list of people, and I have a video of that
way back when meeting with Felipe and Lucy. Fanita?
Oh, well, what I remember about that is that I was visiting in Texas, as far as I remember, at Felipe's, and that we were having a good time, and that somewhere along the line we started talking about starting a USTA organization, and it was all very formal, and we decided we'd go back home or wherever we were, each one in our own neck of the woods, and start promoting
Lucy
it.
get in on
Pulls us back around, because when more people were going and traveling and training in Europe, and energy was going there, and we didn't yet have a U.S. organization, and Felipe had the wisdom to think of one, then we got together and we began that process. And Felipe described well the organizing meeting. The part that he hasn't yet gotten to is that we had our meeting at the ranch, at his ranch. We had the organizing meeting in Snowmass, and we had the best party.
I know, she cut me off.
and at the part, so I'll pick up a little bit on the party.
Yeah.
At the party, it was Fanita who was going around and recruiting people to join.
That's right.
And we had set the dues, and she just went around and got people to give their money and enroll. And Felipe has always been known for a very fabulous child ego state that knows how to have parties. And so one of the things we want to remember in the founding and the starting of USADA is that energy and that spirit of celebration.
I will add, in terms of USADA, I was very active in the ITA stopped having these fun, wonderful winter conferences in warm places.
Yeah.
So USADA saved the day by having conferences in warm places, and for many years in Jamaica. And then we did some training for therapists in Jamaica, and it was all wonderful.
I was at Snowmass at the formation of the USADA. Mm-hmm. And I felt I couldn't join because I wasn't American, but I always participated in the activities, and I've been to Jamaica from time to time. But Leonard invited me to come to Regina and do some teaching. So I used to go up there and do workshops, and we started the Canadian Association of Transactional Analysis there. I was president of that for a few sessions, and, traveled around Vancouver, Regina, Calgary, doing workshops and doing a fair amount of teaching in the Ottawa area. One of the things I really liked about the associations is that it brought people together, people were interested, and also that people found that they didn't have to be physicians or psychologists to be full members. And the association always provided that. And another thing was when we formed CATA, as we call it, a lot of people like teachers, some teachers were active in the association, and people were really very keen.
You will have time to talk about your training.
That time that I saw a 101, attended a 101 done by Kupfer and Golding, essentially Kupfer. Golding was pretty quiet during that time. And that blew my mind. I had, before that, decided I was not interested in GA. I was fascinated by the theory and the book, but didn't want to go further. But once I experienced David Kupfer in a small demonstration group as a part of that 103, I decided that I wanted to learn it. And they circulated a book talking about the new TA school or training that they were developing in Carmel. And they even had a printed application form, which was quite impressive, where you had to describe what you needed and wanted. And I was so impressed by Kupfer that I signed up, and I signed up for this course training in Before that, you see, for me, this I'm so much older than everybody, so I have quite a history long before everything happened here. Before that, it starts with this call to Bern and then attending this first 101 with David. And the funny thing is that I signed up for the school for training in PA, which was non-existent. However, I came to Carmel and was told, or rather, I came to San Francisco and was told, well, no, the training starts in Menlo Park. Well, all right, I went to Menlo Park. There was quite a good group of people allegedly training in PA. However, it turned out they were all patients. And so I was a member of a marathon, of a major marathon run by David Kupfer. And I want to spend time, really a few minutes here on giving credit to David Kupfer, because he's not known and remembered in the PA community because he did not write, unfortunately. He was a tremendous teacher and therapist. And the way he taught was he had people attend his therapy group, tape it all and make notes and meet with him afterwards and discuss everything they considered positive and negative. And they then had people do the opposite, run their own group, and they organized, he and Mary Golding, who at the time was called Mary Edwards, organized a group for me to meet for a cheap rate, $1 per session, because it was admitted that I was a novice. Although I was a practiced therapist in Chicago, and as I mentioned before, I'm happy with the form of therapy I did. Anyway, I started doing these groups. I had never done groups before, which then was critiqued by David. And that was my training in PA, getting my own work critiqued in great detail by David and by others.
You were before there was clinical exams,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't know when clinical exams started, but how did you, so what was it, so you, when did you get designated
How did I get the training that took me to a clinical exam?
Yeah.
I had a crazy clinical exam. The examiners started arguing with each other. I was asked what clients you don't take and so on, and they had a big discussion with each other. And it turned out that Eric Byrne, with whom I had a very strange relationship, had hinted to them that they should fail me. That was a part of the games he was playing. And I suspected afterwards, when he took such a long time deciding whether to pass me or to fail me, and I had not done anything in the exam. And I realized it was Byrne had said that. So I went and talked to Byrne, walked into Byrne's office and said, "You told them to flunk me, didn't you?" And he grinned, he didn't deny that. He said, "It wouldn't have hurt you to fail for once. You feel you're too sure of your success in what you do." And he was right, by the way, on that point.
Yeah.
Well,
But
just
that was the extent of my being examined for clinical.
Fanita has started and talked something about how special and different her training in transactional analysis was. I think that would be true of all of us. The TA training was quite a bit different than training in any other theoretical thing or any of the disciplines. It was quite unique. And so it'll be interesting to see what everybody has to say. Let's see. Vince, you want to start by saying more
Sure. About what I was thinking, my training in social work was in England. And one of the things I remember most is that the professors always said, We cannot just be theoretical. We have to be practical, and we have to learn to work with people at the sort of the ground level. So one of the things they insisted is that we have some political awareness of what are the conditions under which people were living. And one of the things I liked about the early San Francisco seminar, the TA Bulletin, is that Byrne, remember the TA Association adopted a little boy. And that was a very important thing for me, that instead of just staying with the theory and practice, they actually made sure they were socially conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And Byrne also, one of the things he insisted is that if we can make a difference in infant mortality, then we are really being effective in the community. Mm-hmm. I love that about TA. The trainings, as I said, started at Western Institute, and the redecision work that we did there, I remember, was wonderful. There was George McClendon, some of you might remember, and Ruth were in the training group. And one of the things that we had to do is personal work, you know, and one of the things I personally did was, I felt like an outsider, you know, was that, you know, the other people had more experience or something. And Bob Goulding confronted me on that. And he said, "What makes you different from George?" And I said, well, he's a monk. And he's done this and that.
He was a
and he said, "So what?" And that was so important to me that I realized we make up false stories about who we are. Mm-hmm. And the competitive nature of that is so wrong. And it has stayed with me in my own practice ever since. So I love the training. And then after we did, Mary Goulding was my sponsor for the CM. And then they introduced me to, what's his name? Bill Holloway. He had been a president as well.
Yeah.
And Bill, one of the things I remember about Bill, he was so objective about most things. I brought him to Canada to do some work with my students at the time and to observe me teaching my first 101 in order to become a teaching member. And one of my students said afterwards, she said, "Bill is just one nurturing adult." You know, using the TA jargon, she saw him as a nurturing adult. He was so objective. But we had a good time learning. I went to Akron to his place and stuff like that. And then, you know, Denton and I started doing some things together. And we were learning from one another and critiquing one another's work. So my training has been, in a way, all over the place, but it has been a very, very important thing to me. Vann, you will remember my early days that when Graham was still at your institute, mm-hmm. and we did some work there, and I learned a lot while teaching a bit. And one other thing is it was always fun. As you say, conferences were exciting, inclusive, and fun. And in those days, training was a big issue. The Europeans were establishing their own training standards and stuff, and we had to work out how to coordinate what we were doing.
It's very hard to make crisp standards for training and then make all exams competency-based, which was pretty unique to TA. Probably very unique and still unique. So who would like to go next and talk more about your training?
Training, as I said, I first went to Tom and Amy Harris and got my TA 101, and then eventually started my TA training with John Gladfelter here in San Antonio. And he had been to Bob and Mary Goulding, and as a result of that, I went and spent a month also at Bob and Mary Goulding's, which was such a rich experience. And Vince was just describing doing our own work, but also the other thing that was fascinating was that we were to do therapy.
Yes.
You know, that was, I mean, they threw you into the lake kind of thing. It's like swim or whatever. And that was such a rich opportunity because we would work on each other. I'm just thinking about training and the sad situation in the US that the training standards and the training process is so rich, has been so rich, but it never got accepted academically into the universities in the US.
Yeah.
And what's happened in other countries is that they've gotten certification and it's part of graduate programs and so on. And in the US, because I think Byrne was controversial because some of the things that he said, and they called it a pop psychology, which I don't know if we have a chance to talk about it, but when I'm thinking about it, one of the conflicts that I think I've had with the organization, not conflicts, but problems to solve, is that TA is attracted to people who just like TA for their own growth, to the patients, to the clients. Mm-hmm. And they want to learn more and go to conferences. And then there's those people who are professional who want to get more training to do the work. And that has always been confusing, I think, to psychology people and counseling people, marriage and family in the US, because they're so used to just professionals and you never mix with the clients, what they call patients.
Yeah.
So I just that just was flying through my mind. And so after going to Bob and Mary Goulding, I passed my CTA in San Antonio at an American Association of Group Psychotherapy meeting, which is interesting. And on one of my boards for my TA, CTA, it was Fanita, Muriel, and Mary. And I can't remember who the fourth one was, but can you imagine that board? That was so much fun. And then I had training. I went and studied with Jackie Schiff at Cathexis Institute, learned a lot about what they called at the time passivity confrontation. Yeah. And I wrote an article as a result of that called Reactivity, which was instead of being passive to be active. And I've written that article 3 times and it's all about what to do instead of be passive in terms of thinking about feelings and doing something to take care of yourself or respond to them. And so in addition to Fanita, Bill Holloway was also one of my Bill and Marty when he was married to Marty. Yeah. And one of the big learnings from Marty for me was that I remember one time I was, like Vince was mentioning about feeling left out or something. I mentioned to Marty that psychiatrists know more than me, that I'm not a psychiatrist and therefore I couldn't do what Bill was doing. And Marty told me, where did you learn that?
Exactly.
And having a lot of psychiatrist friends who have not been trained in psychotherapy, understand that psychiatrists and psychologists are not necessarily better than me at doing therapy because
Precisely.
of
I
TA.
started off in that marathon with Jackie Schiff and Harry Rose was my first exposure to TA. And then I took the TA 101, I'm not sure with whom, and then started going to conferences and getting a lot of my training by going to workshops at conferences. Mm-hmm. And was my trainer I had a contract with was Ellen Andruzzi, who was a trainee of H.D. Johns, who some people may remember as being connected to Hedges Capers. So there are these lineages. And H.D. was in the Navy, and that was how he had ended up working with Hedges. And then Ellen was his trainee, and I was in training with her. And we had a TA 202 ongoing study group in Maryland with Ken Walgren, who had organized that. So we had ongoing training and meetings and things like that where you could continue after taking the TA 101. And I took my clinical exam, and I was also new education and also new organization. So I took a second exam because at the time there was a distinction between clinical and special fields.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so
I remember that. Yeah.
So my organizational and educational work was considered special fields. And since there were so few of us in it at the time, I remember one of the people who was on my exam was Ed Gurewitz, who said the night before, he'd said, you know, we're examining you tomorrow on this subject. Isn't that hilarious? I mean, it was not difficult for me because I did have specializations more than TA did in education and organization. So it was sort of a mutual teaching opportunity. But since then, it's been good that the separate fields of specialization have developed in TA. You know, I've been part of some of that, but many more people have contributed. After I was trained with Ellen, I trained with Marilyn Zaltzman, who had written the Rackets article with Richard Erskine.
With Erskine, yeah.
And she also had originally been trained by Emily Rupert. So some of the other lineages we're talking about started to connect in. And I got my extended residential training with Vann and with Joe Lewis at Southeast Institute, because I never got out to the Western Institute when they were doing those trainings. But I remember several times where we were staying in near Chapel Hill, and we were every day having training at Southeast Institute. And so that was more my exposure to redecision TA therapy. And I will just mention here for those who may be watching and don't know it, is that at the time, the four main branches of the way TA, there was the classical, there was redecision, there was reparenting, and there was the Escalapian school.
Yes.
Of TA. All of which are important. And some of my very valuable training experience, and I believe it was at Southeast Institute, was a session with Marty Groter.
Yeah.
Where we were learning what was called the game. And it was a variation of the Synanon game. And it had been exported from use in prisons to being used with a broader population. And it was a fascinating and powerful training with Marty. So I'm mentioning a few names for those who along the way have worked with those folks or remember those folks or would like to know more about a lot of the sources of what we now consider the main body of TA. So those were some of my training experiences.
That was the birth of the TAP, Transactional Analysis Practitioner.
Yes, right. Yeah, that started in Jamaica. The owner of the resort said, well, you guys have done TA 101. Now you create a whole training program for me, please, and get it to me in a month or two. Okay. So we did.
And Denton Roberts was very, very involved in that original training in Jamaica. Goulding and I did a TA 101 for that Jamaican group. That was so much fun. Working with Mary was so much fun. I want
to acknowledge you, Val, for the huge amount that you contributed to the TA practitioner training in USADA, and that it's still, those foundations that you built when Granger Weston asked you to develop a training for the people in Jamaica. And then it went to Canada. And then it started coming into the US. And I want to acknowledge Chuck Holland, because he played such a role in promoting the TA practitioner program and making it available, especially to people in the Fort Worth area and around, and people in other regions. So the roots are deep and the branches are broad.
So we were going to talk about our own training. Power of TA. I was teaching at consulting at a regional service center. So I started training teachers, counselors, and principals mostly. And then it evolved into parents too. But they just ate it up. And it was so powerful. Lucy was talking about the applications in organizations, which I did later also. But in education, it's so applicable in terms of discipline, motivation, curriculum building, social counseling, and parenting. And so I just got to where I was doing workshops all over the place because people were just asking for it. And it's not me, it's because TA was not known in this region at the time. And I think as we brought it to our regions, it was just like wildfire, it seemed like to
You
me.
want to talk about your own training program? Vince, you want to talk more about
A lot of clinical training and some organizational consulting. And people were always very keen. And Suzanne and I did weekend workshops and stuff using TA as a basis.
I started doing organizational training because I had actually done marriage counseling, only a few sessions actually, and it was effective, with a man who ran a very important big corporation. And as soon after we finished the counseling, he said, now I want you to do some for my organization, for my top staff there. And I said, I don't know the first thing about organizations, companies, whatever that is. He says, never mind, I'll be there and I'll help you for whatever you do. No. Well, he was there, but he just sat there and didn't do anything, just opened his mouth. Later on, I was told that this session was a major success and led to a lot of big changes. How and why, I didn't know. Well, just the fact that the man had been sitting there and was forced to listen to the complaints of his workers and his executives and whatever. They all heard each other for the first time. And after that, they started communicating. And that was that. And that started my reputation, my big reputation, because I was an expert in organizational training.
That probably was the case for many of us. I was the only advanced member in Indiana. So if organizations wanted something, I was not highly skilled in organizations, but I could teach them the theory and ways to get along better and ways to understand each other better. And it seemed to be very helpful.
Use of Eric Burns' work on organizations.
Yes.
And the structure and dynamics of organizations and groups, which we came to refer to as S&D of O&G. In order to say the whole name. And that even today, as I'm working with the Association of USA TAA and developing the organization, that just being able to pull out some of the concepts from the organizational work, for example, the difference between the responsible, effective, and psychological leaders from every organization, and we have some of them here for both ITAA and for USA TAA. And I've found that side of the work to also be very helpful. And mostly that was learned by going to conferences and giving workshops because there weren't as many organizational practitioners. And I will say that internationally, just want to mention how many people are in the different specializations worldwide. So that part of the flourishing has been the development of practice in the areas. Psychotherapy, they consider counseling a little different. Psychotherapy and counseling aren't the same. They aren't synonymous in TA specializations and organizational and educational work.
Fanita reminded me when she was describing her exam, and some of this is just historic hearsay, but Fanita may be able to verify it more, was that it just sounded to me as sexist and or at least sexist. And the reputation that I remember learning was that a TA seminar, which is how the TA, International TA organization started, was, as everything was, sexist and
unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. And so that's why, Claude Steiner wrote about gender issues at the time, and Pam Levin started the Women's Caucus at conferences to address that issue. So TA has been very involved very early in terms of gender equity. And as a result of that, I remember starting the men's gathering at conferences, and people used to think that that was strange. And because men, you know, and the men's gathering was supporting women's issues, but also being aware that men also suffer as a result of sex role stereotyping.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. And so that continues to go on. But that's what reminded me of your exam, reminded me of that, and the Women's Caucus and the evolution of that.
I wanted to mention one other thing about training I did when I was fresh in TA, because I joke about it from the perspective of today. Is I developed workshops to counter sexism in the 1970s using TA. Using TA and sex role scripting. And so I joke with people and I say, we solved that in 1974. Why is it? and I was working on all the isms. We were working on racism, classism, sexism, you know, with much less awareness and broad knowledge as there is available today. So I am happy to see that is getting a new burst of people's attention. But that was one of the ways I immediately started applying TA to social change and how we could use the theory so that people could become aware of their part in the changes they wanted to see.
My own training started, as I mentioned, when I signed up for what I thought was going to be training, but turned out to be a 5-day marathon therapy for all the people. It was about a group of about 20 people who were all patients and who were all there with their big problems. And I started with saying, me, I ain't got no problems. Why am I here?
Right.
And then I discovered that I had plenty of problems. And so eventually I learned that training includes or consists of becoming more and more clear about your own problems.
Right.
Then you might become a better therapist or whatever, helper, I'll say, to other people about their problems.
I just had a thought when Fanita was talking about TA that I didn't mention about what got me interested in TA and what was unusual about it at the time. One was that to train in TA, you had to do your own therapy. And I never had thought of my own therapy. I had only thought of getting professionally trained to do counseling and to do therapy. And when I went to my one-on-one with Tom and Amy Harris, they had a weekend marathon and for working on yourself. And I didn't stay. I didn't have anything to work on. The more therapy that I've gotten, the more I realize how much I have to work.
Yeah.
And the other thing was that group was new. Roger, I've been training Rogerian groups, but Vern also was very instrumental, and TA was very instrumental that we used groups. So that combination of personal work and groups in the process of training is very unique to TA, I think, even today.
So many things that Felipe and I mentioned earlier. The fact of experiencing TA at both ends, both the recipient as well as the provider. One of the things I remember when I got back to Canada after time with the Gouldings was in the clinic I worked, the psychiatrist in charge was a Trinidadian. And we used to conduct group, what you call it, peer group sessions, as well as the medical students passing through would be encouraged to participate. And some of them started to call our clinic the Calypso Clinic. But more than anything, many of them have continued to become psychiatrists. One guy I know for sure in Calgary, one in Ottawa, and one in Kingston. He's a GP, but he became a GP psychotherapist. And these guys were essentially part of the training. And one of the things that was most useful to them is that they experienced TA as recipients or clients or whatever, as well as learning to teach it. And I think that is one thing about TA that we should never lose. It's extremely important.
Yeah, I think the several folks have mentioned that everybody got their own therapy, and that seems basic and essential, but it's not done in other methods of psychology or in the disciplines.
Yeah.
You can have your own head terribly messed up and still you're qualified to work with clients.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that
and I think part of that is because of the pathologizing approach of the other disciplines. In order to offer treatment, you have to diagnose pathology.
Yeah.
Whereas we don't do that in TA.
No, we set goals instead. Yeah.
Exactly. And as Lucy mentioned,
They
contract.
told me about where did you learn that about psychiatrists knowing more than me about doing therapy. And it's about doing therapy. Psychiatrists, psychologists have their role in terms of medications and not necessarily therapy. So I didn't want to meet, but there's a lot of psychiatrists like Bob Goulding, who is a therapist.
It's a common misunderstanding that psychiatrists are trained therapists.
Right.
They're trained doctors, and they're trained to prescribe medication, and they may be trained as therapists or they may not be.
Right.
Often that's beyond medical school. So we have in TA lots and lots of psychiatrists who are very fine therapists, but they got trained after they finished medical school.
Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, one of the things in my training with the Gouldings, in the 1 month training, there was a conference in Berkeley, or Oakland, wherever. There's a hotel there, and there's an association. I forgot the name of it, whether it was a TA group or it was just a psychiatric association. But Mary sent myself and I'm trying to remember his name, Peck. He's a psychiatrist.
Harris Peck.
Harris Peck and I went to co-lead a workshop, which lasted all day. And both of us were, really working effectively together as young therapists. But at that time, Harris, of course, was older than I was. But there we were, and me a social worker, him a psychiatrist, and we were co-equals. Yeah. And that was a great experience.
Fun to talk about some of these people that we trained with and appreciated and gained a lot. It's important that we're bringing up the names of these people who aren't around and were very influential early, and Lucy identifying the 4 schools that kind of competed, but it was good if you had an opportunity to learn from all of them. I did a lot of training with Hedges Capers, and he also didn't do a lot of writing, but he was a very dear fellow, and I really enjoyed training with him. Hedges Capers. He was based in La Jolla in California.
He was in the same alleged class, which was a marathon, as I was. To pay tribute to David Copper, because his name is not remembered really in the history of TA, because he didn't write. He had all these tapes, and he was sure that the tapes were going to live eternally. But of course, being tapes in our time, they don't exist. I
wanted to mention Nancy Porter Steele and Curtis Steele as people who came out of that group and ended up in Canada. Becoming trainers and therapists in Nova Scotia. Both Muriel and also Muriel James and Dorothy
Youngward
for their bridging the gap, and then Abe Wagner for really developing training organizations.
Yeah.
And he may be giving a workshop for USADA later on this year. But those are some people who really took it forward, because Muriel wrote the OK Boss. They also wrote Winning with People, Dorothy and Muriel. So those were ways that they crossed over that during the 70s.
Yeah.
It was very valuable. And Robinson, who was so active in helping with the standards and the getting the international organizations together, was major contribution.
Well, we're giving thanks. I was thinking also of a lot of people who were very instrumental in USATA early on, including Denton Roberts, Marilyn Cross, and of course, Fanita mentioned already, Muriel, Mary, but then there was Joe Lewis, Val Batch, Emily Rupert, just so many people. Oh, Abe Wagner has been there from the beginning. Al Loeb, do you remember Al Loeb?
We have a few minutes left. Are there things that folks want to add?
The second one is to thank Chuck, who had this idea of getting old timers together. And that this is happening because it's been such a delight. Thank you, Chuck.
Yeah, he spent a lot of time getting this all off the ground, a whole lot of time. So thank you
for
Chuck.
Fanita to get on and stay on throughout this session.
Yes, good for you.
Great.
Thank you.
I'm good and sleepy anyway.
I want to say a special thanks to you, Fanita. I haven't seen you since you were in Canada, and that's many years ago.
It's a tragic time for me. The last contact with you was when my son died, and you were very helpful to me at the time.
I remember that. Oh, yes. But it was a very special occasion, and I'm glad to have been there with you.
I was in Canada doing a workshop for you.
Okay, yes, you were.
That's when I got the news.
So delightful to be with each of you.
Exactly.
And a little sad that we don't stay in touch. And so I hope that we find ways to stay in touch. And the USATA is, I think, working on ways to keep members talking more often.
So, guys, it's been the greatest pleasure and delight to exchange with you again. I haven't seen some of you for a long time. In fact, most all of you for a long time, because I haven't been active. But it's good to really participate and see you and chat with you and laugh and remember the good old days.
I want to say something about the TA community, and I want to say it briefly, but it's very hard because I've always been fascinated with what attracts us to TA and what makes us what we are, a family, you know. And when we get together, it's like we've been together, we haven't seen each other in a long time, but that congeniality happens. And I think what I finally decided was that we like TA because of the I'm okay, you're okay way of being. And the contractual, relational, you know, that you that you have to and be responsible for yourself. That's the other one. I think that those are some of the things that we like about each other, and it's just how can we bottle this? Wayne Hart, who just came back to USADA, has been very involved in other organizations, and he said he just retired and he came back and he said it's like being back home.
Wow.
There's this spirit that we have that's so familial.
Well, and so different from other professional organizations, which aren't fun, and the people aren't close, and they're mostly very competitive.
Right.
So you wouldn't, in the ones I've gone to, you certainly, if you had some problem, you wouldn't tell those people about it. But you could. There was an openness and an acceptance and a playful quality in all of our conferences, and that is and was very attractive, I think, to all of us and many other people.
One thing that I hear from all who have participated so far is the experience was worth it all. the reconnecting, the getting together.
The thing we did today that is useful for people who are interested in TA or already training is talking about those folks who aren't around and the schools of TA and how it was different back then, not better, worse, but just to give folks a little history. I think would be interesting to the new folks who are starting in TA.
I like the spontaneity of this setting and the way we feel about being together and the quality of our relationships. So I think we should preserve this. And if you want to do a theoretical thing, do it in another setting.
I think as we talked together, we demonstrated some of what we like about TA and one another.
Definitely.
And I thought that was good.
Yeah.
Plus you modeled the OK essence of each other. Very beautiful.
I remember our good old days.
We're having good older days now.
Good older days, yes.
Each other. Let's clap each other.
Here's to us.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye,
Not for
Yes,
me.
so.
All did a great job, guys and
Are
gals.
we-
Yeah. Thank you, Val. It's been wonderful to be with you again. And you did a great job of moderating.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, you
You
did.
did a beautiful job. Thank you very much.
Thank you to each of you for making time, for being with us and sharing your stories and history and remembering some of the early leaders that come even before us, and we go back pretty far. So it's been great fun to be with each of you and to talk together.
Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye to each of you, and it was wonderful.
Imagine what it felt like to me when I said my idea to a few people, and Lucy Freedman stepped up and got excited about it and told a lot of people about it. And then I asked for somebody to help with Zoom, and she said Vann wants to do that. So not many people in the nation have Vann Joins as their Zoom guru in the background. Thank you, Vann.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's been fun.
Lucy has kept at it all this time.
Yeah.
Diane Mackey.
Lucy is our steady person over time.
Yes, and Diane Mackey. Yes, Diane and I, since 2003, I'd say Diane and I get to be, you know, we call ourselves the shepherds, maybe.
Yes.
And also Vann, now that you have come visible, Vann, is both with having the Southeast Institute as the longest continuous TA training institute in the United States that should be fully acknowledged.
Yeah.
As the place people can go, whether there have been good times or bad, you could always go to Southeast Institute. So.
It's been fun and it went well. Hooray for each of us.
Goodbye.